Our panelists, our panelists include Dr. Saeed Mohammed, who is the co-founder of the Arab Youth Climate Movement Qatar. Saeed is an environmental policy specialist with over a decade of experience developing policies related to low carbon development, energy transition, climate change, and sustainable community development practices. He is actively involved in Qatar's energy and environmental policy discourse and discussion. Next, we have Ms. Natalie Chung. She is the co-founder of Bear Hong Kong and a leading climate advocate and social entrepreneur born and raised in Hong Kong. At the age of 18, she co-founded Bear Hong Kong, which is a social enterprise which promotes low carbon local tourism as a means to mitigate climate change. She has been appointed to serve at advisory councils of the Hong Kong government and is committed to advancing carbon neutrality in Hong Kong and mainland China. And last but not least, we have Mr. Matthias Lund Larsen, who is currently a double PhD fellow at the Copenhagen Business School and Chinese Academy of Sciences, where he studies the political economy of sustainable finance in China. He is simultaneously a senior research fellow at the International Institute of Green Finance, which is China's main think tank on green finance. He has spent more than a decade working on the intersection between China, sustainability, and finance. And so without further ado, I will hand over the time to Mr. Bandari to kickstart the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mia, so much for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here and talk about climate change and climate policies more broadly, both in China as well as the Middle East, both places where I've studied. So it's quite personal for me as well in terms of looking at what's happening with regards to climate change and energy transition in both the regions. To set up the context a bit, I think I just wanted to reiterate that in the months after COP26 in Glasgow, I think there's been quite a lot of optimism and momentum for climate action. And one of the things that's really mushroomed in the lead up to as well as afterwards is the concept of carbon neutrality as well as net zero. And while some use it interchangeably, and there's a lot of literature on whether or not they can be used interchangeably, I think that will be sort of like the crux of where our discussion will be headed towards. And I think along with that, there's also been quite a lot of momentum and positive news, both in terms of technology. There's been a lot of research as well as market movement towards that. And I guess, Matthias, you'll talk about this a bit later as well, but also in terms of sustainable and green financing is where's the finance and the market moving towards, right? So I guess sort of like fitting these in, the two actors that are very, very important are both China and countries in the Gulf. Mitigation, of course, energy transition, of course, research and development. But lastly, I also want to reiterate that climate adaptation is a major issue both in China as well as Gulf countries with sea level rise, water scarcity, and other things that often go unnoticed or untalked about when we talk about China and the GCC. So I guess sort of like setting that stage, I'd love to introduce the panelists properly, and perhaps the best way is to give them the floor to briefly introduce themselves. In addition to the introduction already being provided by Mia, and maybe also give a bit of background on what exactly you're doing and the type of work and research you're involved in. So Saeed, if we may start off from you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. In addition to what has been said, I'm writing a book on sustainability transition in Gulf states. So I'm just like working on the background and concepts, still haven't finalized the chapters and everything. And so it's an expansion of my PhD dissertation, which is about the political economy of low carbon transition in Qatar. So now I'm just looking at the entire Gulf states. And also I teach at Georgetown University. I teach environmental science and politics. And also I'll be teaching global environmental politics in the coming semester.
Thank you so much. And the book definitely does sound exciting. And I might have a couple of questions on that later on. Natalie, would you like to go now?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And it's nice to be on the panel. Thank you once again for inviting us to the China Gulf Forum. I'm Natalie, and as the moderator has already introduced, I have co-founded a social enterprise in Hong Kong which promotes local tourism. And on the side, I'm researching on energy and climate policy. My research focuses on finding out the sensitive intervention points to accelerate energy decarbonization in the both supply and demand sectors in Chinese cities, focusing on Hong Kong and Beijing. So I guess I can also share more about that later, because when we're looking at the climate system, we need to address the feedbacks and the complex system dynamics, which we often ignore. And once we're able to find those intervention points, we can accelerate the change so that the rapid transition can happen, which at BCC, the latest reports call for. Yeah, look forward to the discussion with the other experts.
Thanks, Natalie. Matthias?
Yeah, I'm happy to give a few more details other than what's already been said, just so you guys can understand the perspective I'm talking from. So I'm a specialist in Chinese sustainable finance, studying these days how green finance is governed in China. And that means, as I'm in part doing a PhD now, I write academic journal articles doing really in-depth and theoretical and empirical research on this topic, but also writing opinion pieces for media and doing some consulting work with the government, intergovernmental organizations and financial institutions. Again, with the idea that we need to change the perception and practice of green finance across the spectrum, from intellectuals and thought leaders to influencers and actual policymakers and financial institutions. So I try to cover that spectrum with what I do. And on the topic, which is again, how green finance is governed in China, I approach that primarily from a political economy perspective. So I look at the role of green finance in China's broader transition and how that's driven from different government bodies and state-led financial institutions, trying to change the incentive structures in the broader financial system so private capital runs in a green direction rather than in a polluting direction. I look at that inside China at the central level and the local level. I look at that across financial instruments from green banking, green bonds, ESG investing. And I also look at that from China towards the rest of the world. And that aspect we can get into more detail with later in the talk today.
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. That's fascinating, and I'm sure we'll get a bit more into that in a bit. So I guess to start off with, and also to set the context a bit more, I'd like to ask Saeed in terms of what's happening right now, right? Like, what's the state of countries in the Gulf? And I guess it's a very broad question because obviously it's not a very homogeneous state and there are different policies within the different countries. But if I may ask you to sort of give a very broad overview on the current state as well as policies that are being taken place by the GCC region towards climate action and net zero, that'd be great.
All right. Okay. I mean, given this very broad and it's all encompassing, and I wanted to kind of limit only on 3 aspects, and then we can just discuss further. Like if there's something specific that we want to talk about during Q&A, I can shed more light on that one. First, NDCs, the national determined contributions in the GCC, and there is a kind of sense of urgency, and the leaders in the Gulf countries started to see it as an economic imperative, and for them to transition to post-hydrocarbon economy, and also there is this very tricky aspect to it, like what transition means here as well. And there are several structural problems, that needs more detailed discussion, and many people consider just with extra bit of solar panels or a bit of renewable energy targets will kind of in a way influence transition, but that's not the case, particularly for the rentier states like the Gulf countries. So it's a whole lot of other discussion, and I just don't want to delve too much into that one. So I'd limit my conversation to energy transition per se. And recently, all the countries have submitted their updated NDCs to UNFCCC, in which UAE has announced to become net zero by 2050 and Saudi Arabia by 2060. And if you just look at, there is a significant change in language, in terms of commitment, in terms of its scale. All of them has changed, from the first NDCs that's been submitted, INDCs that's been submitted 5 years back during the Paris Agreement. And if you see the later submissions, there has been a drastic change in both language and commitment. And that shows that in the last 5 years, things have definitely changed for the Gulf countries. And I can testify to this fact while I was doing my PhD on about Qatar on political economy of low carbon transition, and it was extremely difficult for me to conduct this research because nobody wants to talk about low carbon transition. It was considered as taboo, And by the time I was just finishing and wrapping up my PhD, the low carbon transition or decarbonization, energy transition has become like a norm. Like everyone is just talking about this. Policymakers are like openly flaunting about like, how their energy companies are facilitating energy transition, like Qatar Energy, ADNOC, Aramco, and all these countries. So it's just so strange that like, things have changed quite rapidly. And I guess that's a kind of a way things work, at least in the Gulf countries. Some things do change quite drastically in a short period of time, and some things don't change at all. And that's more or less the state of affairs in this part of the world. And for Qatar, like, it hasn't announced like that it will become net zero carbon, but it has kind of joined the US-led net zero producers forum. Again, how this net zero will be achieved is yet to be seen. There is no kind of a proper guidelines or policies that's been illustrated in the national reports, or some of the reports that they do have, but which has not been shared in public domain, which is difficult for us to assess like whether these net zero plans are actually viable and financially or politically possible as well. And also like in these NDCs, in most of the countries, they didn't really set like emission reduction targets. Like, Qatar, I guess like only one of the two countries that has set like, 30% emission reduction target by 2030. Again, how is it going to be achieved is not being very clear, and it's something yet to be seen in the next few years, and how the government will roll out different policies. And the second, like, it's renewable energy. I guess this is where most of the excitement is happening, at least in the Gulf countries. All the countries in the region have plans for renewable energy uptake, and but like Saudi Arabia and UAE are kind of leading in terms of its national energy mix. A decade ago, if you look at it, none of these countries had serious plans for integrating renewable energy into national utilities plan. Now, the scale, ambition, speed of executing these renewable energy projects is almost equal to China, at least not in terms of the overall capacity. For instance, if you look at Saudi Arabia's renewable energy was like 0.35 megawatts only at the turn of like the 21st century, and the installed capacity grew very slowly, like around 2.35 megawatts in 2010. And now the country is like targeting for 40 gigawatts of solar energy, and along with 16 gigawatts of wind by end of this decade. And like you can just see a kind of a rapid transformation and enthusiasm for embracing renewable energy. And the same case with UAE, like, UAE aims to get half of its electricity from renewable energy sources in 2050. And nuclear energy remains one of the critical components of renewable energy mix, along with solar, thermal, and PV. And UAE planned to increase its coal share like 2 years back, and recently it renounced, thanks goodness for that, because of its increasing pressure from international community. And also coal is coming under major attack from lending institutions, except in the last few months because of the Ukrainian crisis. And the third is the flaring, carbon capture, storage, and other emission reduction. Almost all the state-owned energy operators in the region have pledged to reduce flaring emissions. And this is something that's very, very important. And they see it as one of the low-hanging fruits in the oil, gas, and petrochemical industry. For instance, Qatar invested more than $1 billion to reduce flaring emissions from its LNG operations, which led to reduction in over 70% of flaring emissions between 2014 and 2019 in such a short period of time. And again, like over years of investments in flaring reduction, and particularly in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, has done exceptional work. And like now Kuwait's flaring reduction is reduced by less than 1% of its total natural gas production, contributing to significant savings, both in terms of energy emissions, as well as like in terms of like, actual money by exporting the natural gas that's been flared. And unfortunately, there is very little data about UAE, about its flaring and all of it, because ADNOC doesn't publish its annual reports or sustainability reports, which makes it very difficult for us to really know what is their plans. Although they have some interesting work that's been going on, that's been published bits and pieces. But again, it's very difficult to see an overall trend how Abu Dhabi is doing it when it comes to energy. And moreover, all the oil petrochemical industries, like across all the GCC countries, have upgraded their processes to reduce energy and emission intensity using different methods, including waste heat recovery, new turbines, boilers, and also, to mind you fact, like, some of the most advanced kind of like processes are in the Gulf countries because of its advantage that they set up like in the last 10, 15 years. So they use some of these best available technologies. Like, for instance, Qatar's aluminum smelter is one of the most efficient smelters in the world. Like, even if you compare with Europe or Canada, So it's like because of its advantage that it had like as a latecomer. So, and again, the next one, which is like carbon capture and storage, which wasn't much of the agenda, like in almost all of the GCC states for the last decade. Suddenly it became as a key instrument to reduce its carbon footprint for oil and gas and petrochemical production. UAE has announced to increase the CCS capacity from 800,000 tons to 5 million tons annually by 2030. And same case with Qatar, it planned to store almost 5 million tons of CO2. Aramco, Saudi Aramco, Petroleum Development Oman have all kind of like, use some form of like, carbon capture and storage to enhance the oil recovery in some of its matured oil fields. And other areas that have been in focus is district cooling. I'm coming to an end. Is district cooling, green buildings, sustainable urban infrastructure, and increase in investment in public transport such as metro and other areas have kind of we're going to have a long-term positive impact, and it will try to bend the emission trajectory. And having said all of this, one of the troubling concerns for me is that like most of these countries have scaled up investments in fossil fuel infrastructure. In one way, they're talking about net zero and all of them. And the other way, they're just kind of like, increasing their investments in oil and gas extraction. Like Kuwait is going to increase its non-associated gas production. Abu Dhabi is going to increase its sour gas. And Oman wants to increase like petrochemicals and downstream. Saudi Aramco has invested almost like $40 billion like in the last 2 years alone to increase its oil and gas production facilities. So it kind of like, it's a kind of a paradoxical situation, like, what energy transition means here. I guess that in one way, like as Sultan Al Jaber, like, the energy minister, I guess like the energy minister, the special envoy for climate change for Abu Dhabi has said like, we are just going to be more pragmatic and like, pro growth and pro low carbon. But at the same time, we will not relinquish our vested interest, which is oil and gas industry. I guess that summarizes like, how they really wanted to take forward the energy transition in the Gulf states.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree, and especially the last bit on how you summarize it. I think that's also something that a lot of experts are struggling with, is how does an energy transition look like, and what does it actually mean? And especially with the net zero targets, what does a net zero Gulf state look like, right? And how do you sort of like standardize that? And I know there's been some research, and I think the Science Based Targets has come out with net zero standards and things. So I think it'll be quite interesting not just to see the net zero roadmaps and targets, but also how they'll be aligned with NDCs, for example, moving forward with the global stocktake coming on and stuff. You also touched upon a couple of very interesting things, and unfortunately, I don't think we can dive a bit too much into CCUS, as well as the cooling sector and HFCs. I think that'll be massive with increasing temperatures. But I guess that sort of like gives a very good overview on what seems from the outside a positive momentum towards climate action in the region, but also the paradoxical situation you describe in terms of there are confusions and caveats that need to sort of be further flushed out, and there needs to be more data transparency with regards to a lot of things before I guess we can take a good stock of where the region's headed towards. Natalie, I'll revert next to you now in terms of a similar question, a very vague, but what's happening in China? So China's announced a carbon neutrality goal, not a net zero goal. So what do you think? Is it similar in terms of a very energy transition narrative? Or what do you think are some of the key priorities for China when it comes to carbon neutrality? And I guess a further broader question is, what does that mean for the rest of the world?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I guess overall, it's quite a similar situation to what Saeed has mentioned for the Gulf region, because as we all know, China is the world's largest consumer of energy and also a top greenhouse gas emitter. And the power sector currently produces around 40% of all carbon dioxide emissions in China. So supply side energy transition will be the key for attaining carbon neutrality by 2060. And of course, it has to be matched by demand side measures and infrastructure relevant in the transition, in promoting energy efficiency in industry, transport, and also building retrofitting, such as what you've mentioned, like district cooling system, green building, and etc. So a recent LSE study assessing China's domestic and foreign policies on energy transition and sustainable finance showed that China has actually made great progress in the past year since they have announced the target of carbon neutrality in 2020. And as a Rocky Mountain Institute research also evaluated, China actually has the technological and financial capability to achieve net zero through energy transition. And in IPCC Working Group 3 report published in April this year, which was quite recent, we show that although there are substantial cost declines in renewable energy worldwide in the last decade, the percentage in the fuel mix globally and in China is still quite low, like around 10 to 20%. And when renewable energy is actually the most cost-effective measure to mitigate climate change, there's a need to rapidly scale up renewable energy deployment through supporting innovation research and enabling conditions such as battery storage and infrastructure. China recently, in 2021, they've announced the 1+N policy framework and also the 13% reduction in energy intensity target and 18% target in carbon intensity reduction by 2025. So according to these kind of commitments, IEA estimates that China can peak carbon emissions by 2025 and then start declining from there. So there is indeed a potential to meet the 2060 target on time. And also several of the cities, they've also announced their starting to announce their individual targets. For example, Hong Kong, we have our internal city target of 2050. So we see a bit of ambition in city level, especially in advanced cities. However, as the Gulf region is facing the same issue, one major uncertainty is the projected rapid economic growth of China. So absolute carbon emissions could still be rising per unit GDP, even though the intensities are lowering. And the lack of an absolute emissions cap could create uncertainties in international progress. And one hope is that China's emission trading system officially started July 2021, and it has the potential to drive energy decarbonization and transition. But then one barrier is that the carbon price currently is not high enough. So we really need to drive up that carbon price in order to mobilize the switch away from coal power and incentivize the national grid, NEA, to switch away from coal power to renewable sources. I guess Matthias could fill in with that with his expertise in sustainable finance later. And I guess another hope is that China has announced its goal of not building new coal-fired power projects abroad in the future. So with Belt and Road Initiative and the AIIB, China can indeed foster green commercial investments, such as lowering investment barriers and creating a fiscal space for promoting sustainable development in developing countries through debt collaboration and investing in more green Belt and Road infrastructure projects. So this is kind of like a baseline summary, and see if Matthias has anything to fill later.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think you touched upon very interesting things. And also I see Matthias is smiling because there are a couple of things that he researches on. So I'll definitely get into that. But Matthias, I guess before we get into the nitty-gritties of the overseas investments bit and how sort of that plays into looking into GCC as well as carbon neutrality, as a sustainable finance expert and an academic, where do you see sustainable finance, green finance, climate finance, carbon finance, there's so many finance, sort of like fitting into this carbon neutrality goal, right? Because in terms of NDCs, we've talked about conditional targets, unconditional targets, but now when we look at carbon neutrality and net zero, suddenly the sum required just skyrocketed as well in terms of the money needed for reaching the 1.5 degree goals. So yeah, so that's my question to you on the role of sustainable finance in all of this, and sort of your thoughts on China's carbon neutrality pledge as well.
Right. So sustainable finance is a tool amongst many others for China to reach their climate targets and the overarching green transition. All these aspects is what Natalie just spoke about. So let me dig into the green finance in that. And again, it's a tool amongst others. You can have regulations that say you can't build certain types of projects or have public financing for something, pollution regulations and so on. And you have incentive schemes for renewables and so on, as broader tools for a green transition. And green finance is the part where you use the state apparatus to change the incentive structures on the financial system. And how China approaches that is with a top-down approach. You use central government, state council, Chinese Communist Party guidelines and regulations that say we need to green the financial system. And once that decision is made in the top, it trickles down through the central government ministries and regulators into state-owned financial institutions, all the way through down to local government, again, with the purpose of overarchingly change these incentives in the financial system across all the financial tools, across all the financial system regulators, and across all the stakeholders in the system, from the big investment banks and insurance companies all the way down to individual retail investors. So that's this top-down approach that they take in China. A supply side approach is how the Chinese political economy model works. That's how the Chinese economy is really driven. And we can see that in contrast to a much more bottom-up approach in the European Union, where green bonds and sustainable investing developed gradually, slowly, dynamically from the bottom up since perhaps 2007, when the green bond was issued. And only once there was a substantially large sustainable finance market, the European Union got involved and is now creating standards for green bonds, taxonomy, so what qualifies as green, different kind of disclosure requirements. So a top-down approach in China and bottom-up in Europe. And in the US, there seems so far still to be no approach. The SEC has started talking about requiring some disclosure. And I mean, the financial market is doing quite a lot on sustainable finance, but there's no government approach. They're not facilitating the market. They're not creating the market. So it's top down in China, and that's really what sets it apart and what allows China to very rapidly roll out and scale up the different types of green finance. A key example is that China has one of the world's largest green bond markets. In 2015, China had never issued a green bond. And when the Chinese government came out with regulations and promoted green bonds, the Chinese green bond market became the largest in the world within a year. So that really shows how fast they can scale up sustainable finance products when a decision has been made. What's important also to note in China is that the emphasis is on green rather than on climate still so far. And within green, we both have the climate stuff, but we also have pollution and natural resource preservation, biodiversity, and so on. And the core issue that the Chinese people and the Chinese government is concerned with is pollution, air pollution, soil pollution, water pollution. This is near-term, medium-term, very important factors for the life quality of the average Chinese citizen. When you look out the window and you see heavy air pollution, everyone suffers from that. Climate change is a problem down the road. So China feels they have more immediate problems. And that's why it's called a green finance in China. That's where the emphasis is. There is also discussion on climate finance, but it's less. And there's also, of course, an overlap between the two. When you build renewables instead of fossil fuel energy infrastructure, you avoid both air pollution and climate problems. But in many green taxonomies in China, you still have things like clean coal and other types of fossil fuels. And that means that if you retrofit a coal-fired power plant, you can extremely efficiently actually reduce air pollution with more than 90%. But from a climate perspective, clean coal obviously makes no sense at all, because you can only reduce the emissions by up to 10%. So that shows that the green is prioritized above the climate issue in China. And China has made very substantial progress in greening different parts of the financial system. In addition to the green bonds I mentioned, China is pioneering policies on, for example, environmental information disclosure, where every listed company in China will have to disclose their emissions and their climate strategies and their climate risks. Some stock exchanges around the world require that. They do that in Hong Kong now, for example. But China will be the first place where it will be mandatory for every single listed company in the country, not just by a certain exchange that makes their own rules. So that's a pioneering effort. We see similar things, for example, in the central bank, including green factors in macroprudential regulation, giving different interest rates to banks on their reserve requirements in the central bank, depending on how green they are. Central banks across the world are currently discussing how they can do green finance, but none of them really do much other than stress testing. And stress testing obviously doesn't do anything other than send a signal that there is a climate risk in the financial system. You're not actually changing the cost of financing for banks if you don't literally have it in the monetary policy. China has that today. So they're pioneering these kind of efforts. The overseas component, I guess we can get back to in a bit later in the session today. But a last thing worth mentioning in greening the Chinese financial system is that there are basically two parts of it. The purpose is to green the whole system, but what China has done so far is very successfully developed the green part of the financial system. Huge amount of green bonds and so on, a lot of attention on ESG investing, but they're not doing the other side of the equation, which is reducing the polluting part. The central bank literally has designated financing channels for fossil fuel, for coal companies. They came out with a new package the other day. So while they're pioneering very ambitious green efforts, just to look at the central bank again, they're simultaneously also pioneering terribly polluting efforts for continuing support for coal-fired power plants. And to green the financial system, you obviously have to do both at the same time. And in too much discussion on green finance in China today, it's about China's doing all these great green things, but we really need to also see efforts in reducing the polluting things. And they're often, two sides of the same coin, but there's too much attention to one side of that coin at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. And I think it also goes back to what Saeed was talking about earlier in terms of this paradox, right? So you see this ambition and right, so you see this movement, but also on the other hand, we're left confused. So just very quickly, and maybe this would be for the benefit for the audience. So you talked about the European Union's bottom-up approach and China's top-down, especially with sustainable finance. So could you elaborate a bit more on taxonomies and sort of like how the two are trying to harmonize the taxonomies and what that means more broadly?
Right. So both the European Union and China are developing green taxonomies, and they have done that so far in an uncoordinated way, which means that although there's something like a 95% overlap between the two, if we see it as a Venn diagram, they categorize all the products differently, which means that if you're an international investor and you want to buy a green bond in China, or you're a Chinese green bond issuer and you want to issue a bond in Europe, you have to work between these two taxonomies, and that makes everything more complicated and costly. So China and the European Union are now harmonizing these green bond taxonomies, for example, also other taxonomies. But they have a hard time making progress on that. It seems like they both insist that the other party has to use their basic framework. So we were all hoping that a common taxonomy would have come out by the end of last year. They launched this common ground taxonomy at the COP in November, December. But unfortunately, it was merely a comparison and not a similar standard. So there's both parties recognize the importance of it as a product of how international finance works. It's just much easier to have the same standards. But they unfortunately haven't made enough progress so far.
Yeah, no, thanks for highlighting that. And I guess the point that I wanted to reach to with that is also there are all these things happening domestically in each country and how complicated it gets once you try to harmonize that with what's happening elsewhere, right? So I guess, yeah, Saeed, I'll sort of go to you for the next question in terms of this thing with multiple countries and regional cooperation. And I guess that's something we often talk about when it comes to climate because it is a global challenge and reducing emissions anywhere is supposed to be equivalent to the same thing. But looking at GCC in particular, and reflecting on similar challenges, what's happening in terms of countries learning from each other, as well as what do you think is the role of regional cooperation and cooperation between countries, as well as perhaps with, like GCC and the European Union or China or elsewhere, in your opinion? What's the scope of that or feasibility of that, or if you have any comments on that?
Okay, I'll just focus more first on the regional, like within GCC, and then I'll just discuss a little bit about outside of that. First, in terms of like differences, countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar has have more significant capital, like in terms of investing in climate action, whereas like Oman, Bahrain are kind of lagging behind. Though Kuwait has significant capital, but it is restrained by different political aspirations, so which doesn't let them to invest in it. And also sometimes these countries overdo. I'm not sure if you would agree, but these countries tend to have this aspect of investing too much into vanity projects, like NEOM, like, yes, like it sounds very fancy and everything is just futuristic, sustainable city, but like it's just putting a major hole in state exchequer, and like how much is it really going to contribute in terms of reducing overall national climate action is something like, it's said to be realized, and like no one can really justify the amount of investment. Like if it's just like NEOM, like $500 billion is just invested in one city, that's insane amount of money. And so also, like, I just believe, like, the countries must focus on projects that will have immediate and long-term contribution in emission reduction, as well as like, overall environmental preservation. And for instance, like, I'll give you one example, like about Qatar. Qatar's metro project, which costs more than $7 billion, has limited impact on national emissions. Like, because like I did Qatar's emission inventory from 1995 to 2019. And during this entire time, the transport sector never crossed like, more than 7% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so like, even if you just invest in that sector, like, in replacing private passenger cars, like, with transport, with public transport, still it's not going to make much difference. Yes, like there are other core benefits, like in terms of health, like traffic congestion, but like in terms of environment, like, the emission benefits are very, very few. So my suggestion is that, like, the countries should invest in sectors that will have substantial emission reduction possibilities. And the second one is like the geopolitics and the interregional dynamics of GCC has become complicated in the last 5 years, like particularly after the blockade, things have become really, really bad. And like, even within the small group of 6 countries, unlike European Union with 23 or 27 countries, like, which is own different geopolitics with different languages, like, they have their own set of challenges. But in GCC with only 6 countries with same language, which has more or less like, almost same economic composition, still like has this huge political divergences and aspirations, and each one is competing to be better, like in the region, like, okay, you're going to have a port, I'm going to have a port, bigger port as well. You're going to have one airport, I'm going to have a bigger airport. I guess that is this competing idea of like, within this regional rivalries is really not helping at the long run. Like, it's sometimes it's just going to be look redundant, like, what these countries are going to do eventually. And I guess like the recent spat between Saudi Arabia and UAE has testified to that idea. And also like my feeling is that, like, these regional institutions, which are already very few in the, it's kind of severely hampered by this political deadlock and impasse. And say, for instance, the GCC Secretariat and the plans for connecting railways between GCC cities and the electricity interconnection, like an interregional electricity grid, has been slowed down significantly for both political as well as technical reasons. So the first thing that they need to do is strengthen these institutions, both domestically and regionally, through cross-sectoral collaborations, building capacity of institutions, and sustained political will. That is the most important part, like in this one, and which is often like in shortages in this part of the world. And also it's purely out of whim that, like, this political will comes in. And also a lack of data transparency within and between countries is hampering collaboration. And none of these countries, like, publish their annual emissions, like, the greenhouse gas emissions, like, the oil and gas industry doesn't publish an open platform, like, where people can scrutinize and compare and learn from each other. There is kind of like, huge protection. It's kind of like information blackout, like among all these countries. Nobody wants to share about what's happening in their own country. So it kind of literally stifles opportunities for collaboration and like learning from each other. Having said that, still, like, there is some sort of like, close sector, kind of like, close collaboration between people who is working from this sector and that sector, and they work together and they try to implement things. But like, if there is more open and cross-sectoral collaboration, and we're going to see much better unified action. And also you can see how this has hampered, like, in terms of climate negotiations as well. Until the blockade, all the GCC countries were rallied behind Saudi Arabia when it comes to climate negotiations. But after the blockade, Qatar has its own had its own pavilion, like in climate negotiations, and they just wanted to go ahead in one direction, whereas other UAE and Saudi wants to go in another direction, and other GCC member states were literally stranded in the middle. They don't really know where to go forward. I guess like, this regional cooperation, I don't really have a clear answer, like how it needs to be strengthened, because it's purely political. But there are some possibilities that like one could build relationships, like, there could be collaboration, engagement and discussion with academics, civil society, private sector to learn from each other and exchange ideas and build collaborative and mutually beneficial relationships. The other aspect is industrial collaboration, which I'm just reiterating is like, one of the common things among the region is similar industrial structure, both upstream and downstream in oil and gas facilities, petrochemicals, steel, aluminum, cement. All these are kind of like, unanimous, like, kind of similar in across all the GCC states with varying degrees of production capacities. And all these carbon intensive companies can play a major role in emission reduction and climate cooperation. And like if the regional associations like GPCA, Gulf Petrochemical and Chemical Association, Gulf Aluminum Association, or APEC, all of them collaborate together regularly and learn from each other's would help to achieve perhaps like, with less adverse consequences. And when it comes to regional, like a bigger collaboration, I don't even want to go to look at like European Union. I guess if they focus only within the region, like with Iraq, Iran particularly, and Turkey, like, there's a lot to learn and a lot to exchange ideas and kind of like, get the technical know-how from each other. And China definitely is kind of like making inroads, both in terms of oil and gas, downstream and all these things. There's a lot of scope. Again, I'm not a big expert in Chinese and then GCC collaboration, but based on my reading, there is potential scope that could be exploited.
Thanks so much. That's fascinating, and I think you've hit all the nails. I also wanted to highlight maybe things like even in the Glasgow Pact, the focus on regional collaboration and things is very strengthened, and I guess the MENA Climate Week hopefully was some sort of step ahead in that direction. The other aspect of work that I've been personally closely following is also the carbon market work. And there have been talks about a regional carbon market or a carbon market alliance within the GCC and a common market. And especially now with Article 6, how sort of international markets will work. So that's also another area where I personally think, there could be some regional collaboration, but I guess it also seems very far-fetched and it'll take some time before that happens. So we already were talking about overseas investments and sort of like China's overseas investments and how that aligns or interacts or overlaps with the GCC. So Matthias, I guess I'll go to you in terms of what does the overseas investment bit fit into China? And I guess as a follow-up to that, how does it relate to the GCC? And if you have done any research on the overlaps between China, GCC, and overseas investments?
Of course, I'm happy to talk a bit about that. That is indeed the second side of what I do, both green finance in China and how it goes outwards, including to Gulf countries. So I recently had an article out on this topic that I can give a few details on. We basically look into how the financial system in China creates a financial environment where it's easier for Chinese fossil fuel companies to go abroad than the renewable energy companies. And we find that the reason this is the case, amongst others, but a primary reason, is that it just happens to be so that fossil fuel companies in China are largely state-owned and renewable energy companies are largely private. Historically, that's because in the past, all companies were state-owned and all companies were fossil fuels. So when you were liberalizing the economy, you had new companies coming up, they were private, and we had new industries coming up in renewables. Because the Chinese financial system has a strong preference for state-owned enterprises, because the financiers themselves are largely state-owned, so they have to give to other state-owned organizations. And because the state-owned have, as in their name, government backing, that means that they are lower risk. So those circumstances mean that if we look at Chinese overseas energy investments, statistically speaking, the vast majority has been in fossil fuels over the last 10 years. Only a small part, and only increasing in recent years, are things like wind and solar. Hydropower has been taking place, in particular in Latin America and some Southeast Asian countries. But we can't uncritically claim that this is a green investment. What we need is really wind and solar. So the way that this has to be addressed is changing the Chinese domestic financial system, because that's where the money goes into a company that then in turn goes abroad afterwards. An important part of this puzzle is also to use regulations to limit some types of overseas energy investment. And that's the no energy coal pledge that Natalie mentioned briefly. As Xi Jinping last year said that China would not construct any more coal plants overseas. That was a very abstract statement. We didn't know if that included financing and construction, or when he says China will, is that only the state-owned, or can private companies do that too? And what about the plants that were already under construction, or already had a signature on the financing and so on? And we finally got some details on that just last week. And it seems like China will not, any Chinese organization, state-owned or private, will not finance or construct any coal plants abroad that is not already past the signature stage. So if a project is already well in development or in construction, this will be completed. And for projects, for coal plants that already stand, the Chinese support will stay there. They're not going to sell off the loans to someone else. They're not going to say, we're not going to do maintenance on existing plants and so on. But China will not do much more coal-fired power plants abroad. That goes for GCC countries and anywhere else in the world. In fact, specific to GCC countries is that China has the world's cheapest solar panel technology, and some of the largest solar farms in the world today are being built in GCC countries, Abu Dhabi amongst others. So China can play a key role in the green transition of that region by providing the technology that makes it possible to create electricity as cheaply from renewables as from fossil fuels. Now, how that fits into Chinese overseas finance is, of course, that, as I've mentioned, most of the renewable energy companies, including the solar ones, are private. So they have a harder time getting financing from China to go to GCC countries. Fortunately, they have better links with international financial partners than other companies in China. And that's why this plant under construction in Abu Dhabi, for example, is with Jinko Solar providing the panels. A French company, EDF, is involved in that too, and financiers from across the world are involved in that. And that's a rarity. It is rare to see Chinese renewable companies, or fossil fuel for that matter, work in a consortium of global partners. So this sign that we're seeing from Jinko Solar taking part in this international consortium suggests that GCC countries are actually pioneering some models that can get Chinese renewables out across the world. Again, they have to be part of these global consortiums. If we see that with Jinko Solar, of course, the other big Chinese solar company, Trina Solar, can do the same. And ultimately, Goldwind and Envision and the wind companies can also follow that model. So that's actually a success story that should be highlighted. But within a broader context of overall BRI investments actually having declined quite a lot over the last 2-3 years. We can then see in that context that the renewable proportion has gone a bit larger, but that's primarily because the fossil fuels investment have gone down so fast and renewables haven't actually increased. They just haven't fallen as much. So it's hard to say if this is a COVID circumstance that leads to this decrease in Chinese overseas investment in general, and that will then pick up hopefully at some point, or if this is a systematic sign of more pressure on, for example, Chinese foreign reserves. So there's just less capital flow into projects outside. In any case, if there's a for-profit case for buying Chinese technologies in solar and wind, this doesn't have to be dependent on Chinese financial backing. So that's the other side of why it's a good sign that we see this project with Jinko Solar in Abu Dhabi and other GCC countries, that this can be replicated across the world. And as I mentioned, would not depend on financial circumstances in China.
Yeah, no, thanks, Matthias. That's a great overview. One thing I'd like to add, if I may, is, and I think a lot of people would say this, is it shouldn't just be about ending overseas coal investments, but we've seen out of COP26 the template on the energy transition mechanism in South Africa about also like making sure that we're closing down close coal power plants before their lifespan, right? And the ADB is doing some work on that in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines and stuff. So I just wanted to highlight that point in terms of it does look like a good step in terms of no overseas financing or construction of coal power plant. But I guess, you know, like what we need of the hour is also to make sure that ones that are being constructed or ones that are working, they need to be brought down as soon as possible. I don't know what you think on that.
No, absolutely, especially because the lifespan of a coal-fired power plant is rather long, 30 at least, up to 60 years if you keep some maintenance and updating on it. And that's, of course, way past a climate timeline. So building coal plants is, of course, the worst thing you can do from a climate perspective. Totally climately absurd to still do that today. China still does that domestically, we have to remember. Any fossil fuel, for that matter, is incompatible. Any further investments in any fossil fuel infrastructure, literally as said by the head of the UN and of the IEA, is incompatible with climate agreements. So if China switches from coal to gas and oil, which they still invest a lot in, that is better, but is also incompatible. We literally have to get it down to zero as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing, and this is where your point on consortium really kicks in, is if we need to get rid of the coal power plants or fossil fuel power plants that are already existing, we need a framework and we need multiple stakeholders and multiple players, right? Because that's not just about, you know, shutting down a coal power plant, but it's also about enabling a just transition, making sure that energy access and security is still there. So I'm very pleased to know, and I didn't know, you know, the sort of working together and the frameworks that are being developed for that. So yeah, just hope that, you know, that moves forward accordingly. So after this sort of like a macro look, I guess something else that I've seen over the past few years in climate policy, as well as even at COP, is the role of cities. And I guess, Natalie, I'll sort of move towards you for this. Is we've talked quite a bit on what countries can learn from each other. And that's sort of been the heavy conversation and the narrative around climate, as well as in COPs. But there's this new discourse on what can cities learn from each other. And there's also a lot of work being done in municipal bonds and city level sort of financing for their own projects and climate action, smart cities. So Natalie, so you've got experience in the city level, both Hong Kong and cities in mainland China, including Beijing, I suppose. So would you have some insights on this? And if you could elaborate a bit more on what cities can do and what they can learn from each other with a focus on Hong Kong and Beijing, that'd be great.
Great, thank you so much. I think, as Matthias has mentioned, it's important to take a stakeholders collaboration and sectoral collaboration approach. Even between cities in mainland China, currently there are no explicit mechanisms of learning among the cities. Of course, there are larger international NGOs such as C40 or ICLEA on city level municipal mayors learning from each other, which Hong Kong and Beijing are both part of. But we're seeing a lot of other growing megacities in China that are taking different approaches in addressing the climate change issue. For example, some cities might be more progressive in their hydrogen research, while some cities, for example, Guangzhou has a more well-established mechanisms on emissions trading. So we can see there are different opportunities to learn from each other and foster research and collaboration in between different mainland cities. And another thing that we've found from the research is that different Chinese cities are expected to be setting their internal city level targets in the coming 3 to 5 years. But then depending on development stages of the cities, some cities, according to Beijing experts, they might need to delay their internal carbon neutrality target. For example, heavy industry cities, they might still keep continuing, for example, the iron and steel industry, while heavy industries in Beijing have already moved out of Beijing. And there are issues with emissions leakage that we have to tackle. Where do we draw the boundary when we're talking about, for example, Hong Kong becoming carbon neutral? Are we only accounting for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions? And what about the consumption-based emission? Because Hong Kong is importing essentially 90% of goods from the rest of mainland China, and we don't have our own agricultural industry. So I think there are lots of issues around establishing the city carbon neutrality target or net zero targets that we need to address in the coming years, and how do we draw the boundary and establish an effective city level emissions trading system. And another insight from our research is that the importance of importing and transporting green energy around China. As we can see, the UK, they have large wind power resources, and but they also have like inequity issues where a part of the UK has been producing a lot of wind and sacrificing some of the other economic benefits, while China, the renewable energy distribution is also very segregated. Beijing might need to be importing a lot of wind power from Zhangjiakou and some of the other cities in China. And Hong Kong, we have quite a special situation as a special administrative region. Our electric grid is not directly connected to the Chinese electric grid system. So there are a certain level of inter-city coordination that needs to be done, and which city, for example, might be prioritized for reaching carbon neutrality. So they will harness or establish PPA with some of the individual wind farm or solar farms around different parts of China, and how do we kind of tie that system with the official appraisal system, because we're looking at China might be disseminating these kind of energy intensity target and carbon intensity target to city mayors, and whether this will be tied with officials' performance, and then there will be some kind of official scrambling to get green power from other cities, and how do they reach the community, these kind of agreements with them. So I think there are lots of complexity yet to be resolved. Well, I guess in terms of policy making, there are also areas that maybe the rest of mainland Chinese cities could somehow learn from Hong Kong, where we are taking more of a bottom-up approach in establishing our targets. For example, our 2050 carbon neutrality target, it was announced before presidency's announcement, and there was a whole citizen mobilization exercise and educational exercise involved in the process, where we distributed online surveys to over 60,000 citizens, asking them whether they think decarbonization is important and whether they would be able to bear a high electricity tariff in order to get more renewable energy in a few mix, or they would prefer more nuclear power imported from mainland China, which is also another zero carbon electricity source. And then the results found out that Hong Kong citizens would like to explore even more collaboration with other countries, for example, importing solar from Australia like Singapore does, and some of these other solutions. So we can see the government is also trying to factor in what citizens can accept to afford retaliation and to afford repercussion when they implement the policy. So I believe that it's important to have some sort of bottom-up engagement and education, citizen education on carbon neutrality. Even though carbon neutrality is gradually gaining momentum in the Chinese cities, but the discussions are still mainly focused within the Chinese expert communities or the academia. And the general public, they might have heard of the term, but they don't understand what's the kind of maybe sacrifices or inconveniences they have to bear in order to reach the target with the government or with the national agenda. Therefore, I believe it's essential to get the citizens on board so that we can truly ensure a just transition that is equitable and inclusive for all of the communities in China.
Oh, thanks. And I think the point on education and sustainability, and you touched upon that a bit, and that's also come out in the Q&A. So maybe we'll get back to that in a bit. But I also wanted to give a very quick opportunity to both Saeed and Matthias, if you have some thoughts on this city level collaboration. And sort of, Matthias, you talked about this top-down approach in China, and what seems to be is there's also a bottom-up, if I may call it, or is that still top-down? And Saeed, how does this play out in the GCC? We talked about a regional collaboration, but when we talk about the UAE, are we just talking about Abu Dhabi and the cities with fossil fuel? Or if you have any thoughts on that, the floor is yours.
Well, I guess I mean, in the GCC, there is no bottom up actually. Like everything is just top down, and no matter like if your citizen is educated, yes, like they can raise concerns on Twitter, but that's it. Like again, one of the ways that the citizen is not very well informed is about you don't really put so much information out there for people to be informed. It's some of the struggles that our NGO does is try to make as much as information available to public to make informed decisions, and which as a result we face a lot of problems, a lot of repercussions that I personally have to face doing it. So here everything has states, if it's not coming from the state, nobody's going to take seriously as the private sector, because here it's rent seeking private sector, unlike in Europe or in other countries where private sector has its own goals, ideas, and but in the Gulf, you really have to make sure the rulers are happy, and the private sector, which is kind of basically a strong and small coordinated merchant community who pretty much dominates the entire private sector. And also the private sector is a kind of an auxiliary source of income, exception of Dubai. And whereas the public sector and most of the revenues comes from state-owned enterprises, and they predominantly takes the share, and the state redistributes the wealth in the form of public employment and as well as subsidies. So the public sector is not going to go out of the way and do things and whatever they will do, it'll be just for kind of infatuation, or okay, everyone is doing it, let's do it. But it's not something it's going to be part of their corporate system, corporate plans, or the members of the board are going to take it seriously. Even if they do it, most of the members of the board in these big corporations are still part of the royal family members, or the big family members who are still connected to royal family in one way or another, because of its very small interconnected societies in the Gulf. So it's a huge challenge. Even if you mobilize the private sector to take action, they're not going to do it unless if it's a strong regulation comes from the state, not necessarily regulation in a hard way as a law or as a decree per se, but even a verbal commitment from the ruler itself will make changes. I'll give you one example. For Qatar, because I'm familiar with Qatar because I did my whole PhD about it, so I know what's happening here in and out. The energy ministry was not very much keen about taking climate action until when the Amir of Qatar in the UN General Assembly made a commitment that is going to give $100 million to least developed countries. And immediately the response, the language has changed in the oil and gas industry, that they keep always citing what Amir has said in the UN General Assembly, saying that yes, the country is committed for climate action, and we're going to step up our commitments and efforts as well. So that kind of verbal commitment, there is no kind of a set target for the state to reduce one. Only in the last 2 months, we got this new NDC. Until then, there is nothing specific, and but still, the people, that the industry is trying to rally behind the state rulers, and so that's how things work here. It's completely different politics, it's completely different dynamics, and the relationship between the private sector and the state is so different than what you have in more liberal and coordinated societies in Europe or in India and China. I'm not sure much about China, but at least I know for India, Europe, it's entirely different. So I guess that's the kind of nature of autocratic states, how things work.
Matthias, any thoughts on the city level?
Yeah, if I can just add 2 points, especially as we ended a note on the authoritarian states. I mean, the similarities in the governance model between GCC countries and China is at that level. And that means that as China is pioneering many green finance policies, they can be replicated in other countries that have a similar political system and take a similar top-down approach to driving the green finance transition. That doesn't mean we should expect GCC countries to be leading manufacturers in solar panels, but they can change the incentive structures in the financial system with the same tools that China has pioneered and gathered experience and lessons from over the last 5, even 10 years now. So there's a lesson to be learned there. Another aspect is the idea that we just spoke of and highlighted the importance of Chinese technology providers being part of international consortiums. Now we have both coming out of the US and the EU global infrastructure, and with a big green part, in fact, the American Build Back Better World initiative and the EU Global Gateway. Presumably, if this talk is followed up by actual money committed by respective governments, that could be a big driver of de-risking green infrastructure projects across the world, including in GCC countries. If that overlaps and is coordinated well with the Belt and Road Initiative, then that is a great opportunity to scale up this kind of global cooperation in project development, technology provision, and financing of green infrastructure.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great way of summing up. And I guess that was also sort of the last question I had, but you sort of gave an insight to that. So with this, I would like to ask the organizers on the Q&A session if there are any questions or how we can proceed with this. Or else I also have some backup questions we can ask. But Mia, I guess you can sort of provide us with insights on how that'll work.
Yeah, I think we can, it looks like, oh, okay. It looks like we're getting some questions right now. So if you, can you see them in the Q&A box below?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you can just answer them. You can just choose them and read them out and have people answer them. And then if there's no more questions, but we still have some time, you can go to the backup questions.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So this other question, I think I want to go back into it a bit more in terms of sustainable education, right? And perhaps like one of you could answer this, maybe Natalie. What's your take on sort of the role of sustainable education? And I think this question more means education about climate change and environment and more of that sort. So what's your take on where we are now, and what are the things that our curriculums need to adapt so that we can sort of like champion this even more? And I guess Matthias, Said, if you want to sort of fill into that, please feel free.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think actually one of the sensitive intervention points to tip the system and to accelerate decarbonization is citizens' education and awareness on carbon neutrality, as well as understanding of industry professionals, because we don't only want the academia to understand about carbon neutrality, but we want building professionals to know what's the way forward for green buildings and BMI systems. And we also need industry experts to streamline processes to enhance energy efficiency of smelting, etc. So I think it is very crucial for China and GCC countries to start developing a robust syllabus around climate and sustainability education, meaning that citizens need to understand why is there the need to attain carbon neutrality and how our demand side measures link with our personal behavior, which includes, for example, our electricity consumption patterns. Some of the experts I've spoken in Beijing also recommended that, for example, in order to moderate the peaking of electricity usage, we can assign different times for people to cook dinners. Some people can start cooking at 6, while some people can start cooking at 8. By doing these kind of little behavioral changes, we can accommodate a fuel mix that has more renewables, more intermittent and fluctuating supply. I think these are crucial aspects that citizens need to be aware of. While for sustainability and climate education, I personally believe another core component is the exposure to nature and wildlife, understanding of biodiversity and seeing the value in all these natural carbon sinks and how sustainable land use practices can accelerate carbon storage as a natural sink. We see the immense potential of wetlands and forest in sinking carbon. And the IPCC report also highlighted that sustainable agriculture will be able to store a large amount of carbon in the soil. As you know, China is a leading agriculture exporter, so educating farmers will also be important by teaching them ways of practicing climate smart agriculture and also developing regenerative models in agriculture so that we can also link the food system's dietary changes with all these regenerative practices to co-create a future that is inclusive and able to meet our net zero targets.
Matthias, you're deeply involved with universities as a researcher, as
Yeah.
at QFE with IIGF.
Yeah, from a number of angles, and also having studied in different places. So I'm quite familiar with education and how sustainability and sustainable development, sustainable finance, and so on is taught both in the US and Europe and in China. And it seems to be increasingly available to students to pick classes on these topics, largely driven by demand side attention. Students want to study these things, so that is a great sign. There's no question that the younger generation is much more interested and committed to sustainability than the older generation, unfortunately. So those types of classes are more and more available. Yeah, in that regard, the think tank that I work for in China, the International Institute of Green Finance, is located in the Central University of Finance and Economics. So this think tank both organizes sustainable finance lessons for university students in this university, and to mention something relevant to all the attendees here today, which I understand are mostly students, we take interns. We have internships at this think tank. So if anyone is interested in getting a hands-on research experience working on Chinese sustainable finance, feel free to reach out to me. So both education and classes and possibilities for internships exist more and more across the world, and I think that's certainly a good sign.
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. Said, please go ahead.
Okay, I will speak more from a practical, because like our NGO that's based in Qatar does quite a lot of activities on the ground. Again, I believe more than just like normal education. This is a bit more controversial in this part of the world where citizens doesn't have voice to challenge, like, to the state policies or anything that for us is also difficult. But one of the projects that we try really to do is that, like, to understand the implications of human activities, not within their own community, but as well as like far-reaching communities as well. That's something that we do. One project that we started is called Household Carbon Footprint Initiative, which we started with high school students, like students above age 12. What we did was we created an app and tool where they have to collect 1 month long data from their schools, from their households, every single activity that they have to monitor, like in terms of electricity, water from their bills, like how much they consume, where their food consumption comes in. So it's a very, very comprehensive information collection that they have to do. And once they put all this information, and then the student gets the amount of total carbon footprint of their households, not as an individual, but as a household. And it will compare with the different households, with the similar socioeconomic backgrounds, as well as number of people in the household, because Qatari families are far bigger than non-Qatari families. Also, so there's a way that we kind of try to create this equalized carbon footprint. And so we try to kind of change the idea of, rather than just telling, oh, like climate change is happening, but we really wanted to tell consumption that the way we consume, even if we put solar panels, we are not going to meet the demand for it, because like our energy consumption, like if you look at, there was a study done, that even if you fill all the rooftops, like in Japan, it will just give like only 10% of the electricity. That's the kind of level of consumption that we do. We really need to kind of position ourselves, our activities, small activities might have smaller difference, but we really need to substantially rethink about the way we produce our goods and activities, our economic activities, our financial activities, all these things, which it doesn't still get into the popular discourse. I guess we are still under very, 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 we don't really talk about the role of banks, in funding all these big projects, mega infrastructure projects that has a huge climate implications. And again, we push individuals and citizens, this is something we talk about, individualization of climate change activities, rather than putting the onus on the people who are primarily responsible. Again, I'll give you one small example of UAE. Even if you tell UAE members to the plant trees and everything, it will still have a very limited impact. One project in UAE, with the carbon capture and storage, which kind of saves almost 4.7 million tons of CO2 emissions, which is almost equivalent to the size of the 2 UAEs of forest, amount of the carbon that will be stored in that one. So yes, individuals have a limited capacity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but there is a significant way of change how we need to shape environmental discourse in the community.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think I 100% agree with all three of you. And Matthias, thanks for providing the internship opportunity. I've sent the institution's name. Two things that really struck me, and I think that really resonate with me. One, so much because I recently read an article on the consumption-based tax in Sweden or something. And I think, Natalie, you talked a bit about the consumption aspect of things, and I don't know where that's going to lead into, but that sounds pretty interesting. And as a climate activist, you know, it's something that I've struggled with, and like advocating for climate action with friends and stuff. Like, how do you sort of promote that behavior? But the other thing that's really personal to me, and it's sort of the backbone towards why I work on the space, is what Natalie talked about earlier in terms of the interaction with nature, right? And why like it's so important to sort of go beyond the classroom and go beyond these awareness sessions and to actually look and feel and understand what is it that we're losing. And I've written extensively on this as well, but at the same time, it's also something that's so inaccessible to many students in many regions around the world. So this entire concept of awareness and education that's beyond the classroom and interaction with nature, I think, you know, that really should be, so students and young people can come up with this within themselves, as opposed to sort of like, again, if I may say, a top-down sort of being forced into it as a supply thing and more of a demand thing. The other question, there's lots of questions. One question that I wanted to sort of like look into, and if either of you think there's other questions you'd want to sort of target, is this prospect for future international cooperation regarding sustainable goals. Let's focus on climate action, maybe perhaps not all of the SDGs, because I'm not overly optimistic on the SDGs. But one thing, I guess, that I wanted to sort of point out is the role of carbon price. And that's something we haven't discussed in great detail in this conversation, but there seems to be quite a lot of momentum on carbon price, both with regards to perhaps the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is thinking about, as well as the IMF recently came out with a proposal on a carbon floor tax. So not a proposal, but an idea on a carbon floor tax. So I think that's also another area of international cooperation, sort of like on taxation and things like that, that could, especially on cross-border trade and taxation, that could be an area of international cooperation that could further help us reach the Paris Agreement goals. So I wanted to add that point, but if anyone else, you want to add more points on this international cooperation question, please feel free to do so as well.
I mean, I'm happy to make a comment on the carbon adjustment mechanism. From a Chinese perspective, they're terrified of this prospect, both because the EU is a large export market and because if the EU does it, other countries might do so as well. And that would be a direct punishment of countries with high emissions per GDP generated. And China literally has a higher GDP, higher emissions per capita than the European Union, even though the European Union has 5 times the GDP of China. So the emission intensity of China is 5 times that of the EU. So if you put a carbon adjustment mechanism in a place like the EU to make sure that the products imported into the EU pay the same level of carbon tax as in the European Union's own carbon tax system, then a place like China would face a heavy punishment because, as Natalie mentioned, on the Chinese emission scheme, the price is just way too low, much lower than what we have in the EU. So there's the prospect of if that becomes a global trend, then some countries like China would be concerned. Though I think that this would be a very powerful mechanism, and I really hope that the European Union is successful in rolling that out.
Final thoughts, Natalie, Saeed, Matthias. I guess it's time to wrap up the conversation, and we can go on and on about CBAM and sort of the WTO stuff, and the price floor work is quite interesting as well from the IMF. And yeah, but I guess we have to wrap this conversation up. I've learned a lot, and thank you so much for your time. But before we finish up, any parting words, I guess, to our students in terms of opportunities as well as way ahead and what they should be thinking about, as well as, I guess, with a focus on the COP28 that is going to be hosted in the UAE. And I'd imagine NYU and the China Gulf Forum can also play an active role in COP and sort of, like provide some inputs on that. So any final words, the sequence of Natalie, Saeed, and Matthias, please. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting again. I guess my final word is really to encourage everyone, student, to go up to the nature and think about what is the future of our tourism and how to connect it with nature, because we're seeing flights being canceled and everyone is staying more locally. And we also see roads converted into pedestrian ways, and people are starting to focus more on local agriculture, growing your own food, and a less kind of extractive way of living. And we can all be more self-sustained in the way we live, and also by connecting more with nature. So I believe in the power of nature and ecotourism in bridging that kind of human-nature relationship, which is the incentive for everyone to live a low-carbon life, and enabling all these supply side transitions to happen once we've fixed our demand.
Saeed, would you like to go ahead?
I just wanted to highlight the project that I'm doing which I'm trying to work with the Abu Dhabi Environment Agency, and as well as Saudi Arabia, Oman, to scale up this project that we are doing it, because Qatar, in the region, we don't really have about household carbon footprint, like how much we consume. Again, I developed the Qatar's consumption-based emission inventory from 98 to 2019, which often Qatar gets lambasted in Western media for highest per capita emissions. I guess all the region is the same problem. So I tried to kind of change the narrative, why we really couldn't use, why we shouldn't use this production-based per capita inventory rather than consumption-based emission inventory. And so the report is on the website, if anyone wants to read about it, and we are coming up with a new report for the whole Gulf countries as well. And if any of you schools, university students are interested in being part of this carbon footprint in your household, then you can just use this link to be part of the conversation, and we will find ways to collaborate and do it.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Yes.
Final words from my side. I think it's important, or let's say when I started studying sustainability things 10, 15 years ago, it was a clear trade-off between doing something I found very interesting, sustainability, and then making fast and successful career, because sustainability was really on the fringes back then and hard to predict how the economy and labor market would develop. Today, as sustainability and climate issues is being so integrated, there's no more this trade-off. It might in fact even be a competitive advantage for students to have a very strong sustainability and climate profile. So that should be seen as an encouragement for students to take climate issues very seriously, not just as a personal interest, but also as a career.
Well, I definitely echo that. And as a youth climate advocate, I recommend all of you to really follow the news closely, reading simple things like the Carbon Brief, and get an understanding of the issues and where you can start advocating from a young age. For example, organizing a community project on composting or on local agriculture, and it can make a huge difference with your small steps.
Yeah, thanks. And if I may, I think we've got a couple more minutes, or I'm getting confused about the time. But I guess, Matthias, building off of what you said, something that I've also noticed is you can build a career in climate and sustainability from every possible subject or field at this point, right? Either it's engineering or finance or economics or business or education or sociology, politics. So I think that's also another way of looking at it, is an opportunity. So you don't necessarily have to study climate. You don't necessarily have to sort of do an undergraduate degree in climate, but you can sort of be in your own major and your field of interest, and look at how climate change and sustainability sort of can factor in, and how you can support, and perhaps that can also bring more innovation and more sort of out of the box thinking when it comes to looking at innovative solutions. So I guess, and I say that, and I personally say that because I've barely taken a class on climate. I come from an economics background, haven't really studied climate, but it's just something I deeply care about. But anyway, I think yeah, I'd just like to thank all of the attendees as well as the panelists for your time. Thanks so much for your valuable insights, and it was a pleasure, to say the least. And back to you, Mia. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rastra. Yeah, and thank you so much to our panelists and the moderator for a great conversation. We really appreciate that you guys took the time to speak with us today, and I think we all learned a lot. And now we will have a brief, about 5-minute break until our next session on arts and culture, which will begin at 5:30 Abu Dhabi time, 9:30 p.m. Beijing time, and 9:30 a.m. New York time. Thank you.